Chapter 1: The Haitian Inheritance. The rain lashed against the windows, casting ghostly shadows across the dimly lit nursery. Young Annie Palmer sat huddled on her bed, clutching a tattered doll to her chest as the storm raged outside. At only 8 years old, she had already endured more sorrow and loss than most children her age. It had been 2 years since the carriage accident that had claimed the lives of her beloved parents, leaving Annie alone in the world. Her mother, a delicate English beauty, and her father, a successful plantation owner, had been the center of her universe. Now, their faces had become hazy in her memory, replaced by the looming presence of her Haitian nanny, Delphine. Delphine had been a fixture in the Palmer household for as long as Annie could remember. With her dusky skin, piercing eyes, and a demeanor that simultaneously captivated and unnerved, the nanny had assumed the role of Annie's primary caretaker after the tragedy. It was Delphine who soothed Annie's nightmares, Delphine who fed her, and Delphine who taught her the ways of the world. As the storm outside grew more intense, Annie turned her gaze to the small table by her bedside, where a curious collection of objects lay. Delphine had gifted her these items, each one imbued with a sense of mystery and power. There was a small wooden figurine, its features contorted into a grimace, and a set of colorful beads that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Annie's fingers traced their intricate patterns, a familiar comfort in the midst of her grief. "Chérie," Delphine's voice drifted from the corner of the room, her accent thick and melodic. "Why do you sit alone in the dark? Come, let me tell you a story." Annie looked up, her eyes meeting the nanny's gaze. There was a glint in Delphine's eyes, a spark of something that both captivated and unsettled the young girl. Silently, Annie followed Delphine to the rocking chair by the fireplace, settling into the familiar embrace of the weathered wood. "This is a tale of power, my child," Delphine began, her voice low and hypnotic. "A tale of a people who have learned to harness the very forces of the universe to their will." Annie leaned forward, her eyes wide, with rapt attention. Delphine's stories had always held a sense of magic and mystery, transporting her to a world far removed from the stifling confines of the plantation. "In the land of Haiti, where I was born, there is an ancient practice known as voodoo," Delphine continued, her fingers tracing the beads on Annie's table. "It is a religion of the spirit world, a dance with the Loa, the powerful spirits that govern our lives." Annie felt a chill run down her spine as Delphine's words evoked a world of shadows and secrets. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the mesmerizing cadence of the nanny's voice. "With voodoo, one can bend the very forces of nature to their will," Delphine said, her eyes locked with Annie's. "The Loa can bring about great fortune, or they can unleash unspeakable calamity upon those who cross them." Annie's heart raced, her mind filled with images of the wooden figurine and the shimmering beads. She had always known that Delphine was different, that there was a hidden depth to her that the other servants did not possess. Now, as the nanny spoke of voodoo and the Loa, Annie felt a growing sense of fascination and trepidation. "But voodoo is not to be taken lightly, my child," Delphine warned, her expression suddenly grave. "It is a powerful force, one that must be respected and wielded with great care. For those who seek to harness it without understanding its true nature, the consequences can be dire." Annie nodded solemnly, her fingers tightening around the doll in her lap. She knew that Delphine was speaking from experience, that the nanny had witnessed the dark power of voodoo firsthand. "You have a special gift, Annie," Delphine said, reaching out to gently tuck a stray curl behind the girl's ear. "A connection to the spirit world that few possess. It is a burden, but also a great responsibility." The thunder outside rumbled, and Annie felt a sudden sense of foreboding. Delphine's words had awakened something within her, a dormant power that threatened to consume her very being. "I will teach you, Annie," Delphine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will teach you the ways of the Loa, the secrets of voodoo. But you must promise to use this knowledge wisely, for the consequences of misuse can be devastating." Annie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that her life would never be the same, that the path before her was one of darkness and uncertainty. But in the face of Delphine's unwavering gaze, she felt a sense of purpose, a calling that she could not ignore. As the storm raged on, Annie Palmer sat transfixed, her destiny forever intertwined with the ancient powers of voodoo. Chapter 2: The Arrival at Rose Hall. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the grand ship carrying Annie Palmer docked at the bustling harbor of Montego Bay. After days spent cooped up in the cramped confines of the vessel, the sight of the lush, verdant landscape of Jamaica was a welcome respite. Annie stood at the railing, her eyes sweeping across the bustling port. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the briny tang of the sea, a far cry from the humid, fragrant atmosphere of her childhood home in Haiti. Though the journey had been long and arduous, a sense of anticipation had begun to stir within her. This was the start of a new chapter, one that held the promise of power, wealth, and control. A commotion on the dock below drew Annie's attention, and she watched as a procession of servants and carriages approached the ship. At the center of the entourage stood a tall, imposing figure, a man whose very presence commanded attention. This, she knew, was her husband-to-be, John Palmer, the wealthy Jamaican plantation owner. As the gangway was lowered, Annie smoothed the skirt of her traveling dress and descended, her eyes carefully appraising the man who would soon be her partner in life. John Palmer was a striking figure, his angular features and piercing gaze exuding an air of authority. He stepped forward, a polite smile gracing his lips as he extended his hand to greet her. "Welcome to Jamaica, my dear," he said, his voice rich and warm. "I trust your journey was not too arduous?" Annie accepted his hand, her own fingers curling around his in a delicate grip. "Not at all, Mr. Palmer," she replied, her tone measured and demure. "I am simply eager to begin this new chapter of my life." John's brow raised slightly at her words, a glimmer of curiosity reflecting in his eyes. "Well, then, let us not delay any further." He gestured towards the waiting carriage, his gaze sweeping over Annie's slender form. "Your new home, Rose Hall, awaits." As the carriage rolled through the bustling streets of Montego Bay, Annie found herself transfixed by the vibrant sights and sounds of the island. The buildings were a riot of color, their facades adorned with intricate carvings and ornate balconies. Vendors hawked their wares, their voices rising in a cacophonous chorus, while the air hummed with the rhythmic beat of drums. It was a world so vastly different from the serene, muted tones of her childhood in Haiti, and Annie felt a stirring of anticipation within her. This was her new reality, a world of opulence and possibility, and she was determined to seize it with both hands. As the carriage climbed the winding road towards Rose Hall, Annie's breath caught in her throat. The plantation house was a magnificent edifice, its grand white columns and sprawling verandas a testament to the wealth and power of the Palmers. Surrounding it was a verdant tapestry of lush gardens, fruit orchards, and neatly tended fields, all bustling with the activity of the countless slaves who toiled beneath the relentless Caribbean sun. "Welcome to your new home, my dear," John said, his voice tinged with pride as he ushered Annie up the grand staircase and into the opulent foyer. "Rose Hall is the crown jewel of my family's legacy, and now it is yours as well." Annie's eyes swept across the lavish surroundings, taking in the ornate furniture, the towering ceilings, and the intricate woodwork that adorned every surface. It was a far cry from the modest comforts of her childhood home, and she felt a sudden pang of unease. "It is magnificent," she murmured, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns of a vase that stood upon an ornate side table. "But I confess, I feel quite overwhelmed." John chuckled, his hand reaching out to gently grasp her elbow. "Understandable, my dear. This is a vast estate, and it will take some time to become accustomed to its grandeur. But I have no doubt that you will come to embrace it as your own." Annie nodded, her gaze drifting towards the towering staircase that led to the upper levels of the house. "And what of the staff?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I assume there are many who see to the day-to-day operations of such a large property." "Ah, yes, the staff." John's expression grew more serious as he guided Annie through the lush, sun-dappled corridors. "Rose Hall is home to a sizable workforce, both in the house and in the fields. They are a necessary component to the smooth running of the estate, though one must maintain a firm hand to ensure their compliance." Annie felt a chill run down her spine at the implication in John's words. She had heard the whispers of the harsh realities of plantation life, the cruelty and oppression that permeated the colonial system. Yet, as she followed her husband through the grand, imposing halls of Rose Hall, she could not help but feel a sense of unease. "I trust that you will find your place here, my dear," John said, his tone reassuring as he led her to a set of ornate double doors. "This will be your domain, your sanctuary within the larger estate. I hope you will come to see it as a reflection of your own vision and taste." As the doors swung open, Annie's breath caught in her throat. The room before her was a vision of opulence, with high ceilings, ornate furnishings, and a sweeping view of the verdant grounds beyond. It was a world away from the modest comforts of her childhood, and for a moment she felt a surge of pride and excitement. Yet, as she stepped into the room, a subtle shift in the air caused her to pause. There was an undercurrent of tension, a palpable sense of unease that seemed to permeate the very walls. Annie's gaze swept across the room, her eyes catching on the intricate carvings that adorned the ornate fireplace, the delicate lace curtains that framed the windows, and the plush, inviting furniture. It was a picture of overwhelming grandeur, yet Annie could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. The shadows seemed to linger a little too long, the silence a little too heavy, and the air a little too still. As John watched her with an expectant gaze, Annie forced a polite smile to her lips, her mind already whirring with the possibilities that this new chapter could hold. For beneath the veneer of opulence, she sensed the potential for darkness, a power that she had only begun to glimpse in her time with Delphine. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her fingers trailing along the polished surface of a side table. "I cannot wait to make it my own." And as she spoke those words, Annie felt the stirrings of a new obsession, one that would soon consume her very being. Chapter 3. The White Witch's Rise. The weeks and months that followed Annie's arrival at Rose Hall were marked by a steady transformation, both within the Grand Plantation and within Annie herself. As she settled into her new role as mistress of the estate, a darkness began to take root, one that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of all those who crossed her path. Annie quickly grew restless with the confines of her gilded cage. The opulent trappings of Rose Hall, once a source of excitement and wonder, now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the limitations that her new position as John Palmer's wife imposed upon her. The servants who scurried about the grand halls, their eyes averted in deference, only served to heighten her sense of isolation and the longing for the freedom she had once known. It was during these moments of discontent that Annie's thoughts would drift back to the teachings of her beloved nanny, Delphine. The memories of the woman who had raised her, who had shared the secrets of voodoo and the power of the Loa, became a siren's call, whispering to Annie of a world beyond the stifling constraints of her privileged life. Quietly, Annie began to explore the darker corners of Rose Hall, seeking out the hidden spaces where the shadows seemed to linger a little longer, where the air carried a subtle charge of something otherworldly. It was in these secluded alcoves that she would study the objects Delphine had gifted her, the wooden figurine, the shimmering beads, and the arcane texts that detailed the intricate rituals of voodoo. As her knowledge and understanding of the dark arts grew, Annie's sense of purpose began to crystallize. She would no longer be content to simply occupy the role of a plantation owner's wife, a decorative figurehead in a world of opulence and excess. No, she would wield the power of voodoo to shape her destiny, to assert her control over the very forces that sought to constrain her. It was a slow, methodical process, one that Annie approached with a calculating precision. She began by testing the limits of her newfound abilities, experimenting with the Loa, the spirits that Delphine had described as the very conduits of voodoo. At first, the results were subtle. A servant who fell ill with a mysterious malady, a prized racehorse that suddenly lost its competitive edge. But as Annie's confidence grew, so too did the scope and intensity of her manipulations. The servants of Rose Hall, once cowed by the imposing presence of John Palmer, soon found themselves living in a constant state of fear and unease. Whispers of the White Witch who stalked the corridors of the plantation house began to spread, their voices hushed and trembling. Annie had become a figure of legend, a cruel and capricious mistress who wielded the dark arts with impunity. John Palmer, oblivious to the growing power that his wife wielded, remained largely indifferent to the rumors and superstitions that swirled around Rose Hall. He was a man firmly rooted in the realities of the colonial system, a believer in the rigid hierarchy that placed the plantation owner at the apex of the social order. The notion that his wife, the delicate English beauty he had married, could be the source of such dark and unsettling events simply never occurred to him. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that Annie's control over the estate began to solidify. She orchestrated a series of accidents that eliminated those who dared to challenge her authority, their deaths shrouded in a veil of mystery and the lingering whispers of voodoo curses. The slaves who toiled in the fields grew increasingly fearful, their whispers of the White Witch becoming a constant refrain that echoed through the lush, verdant landscape. As the bodies continued to mount, Annie's reputation as a figure of terror and legend only grew. The once vibrant Rose Hall began to take on an air of oppression and decay, a physical manifestation of the darkness that had taken root within its walls. The servants moved in hushed silence, their eyes darting nervously as they went about their daily tasks, ever wary of incurring the wrath of the mistress they had come to fear. John Palmer, oblivious to the true nature of his wife's machinations, remained content to bask in the wealth and status that Rose Hall provided. He was a man of the colonial system, his power and privilege secured by the exploitation of the very people who now lived in terror of Annie's reign. It was a willful blindness, a refusal to acknowledge the horrors that unfolded beneath the veneer of his family's opulent legacy. As the months passed, Annie's hold on Rose Hall tightened, her dark powers becoming an ever-present force that permeated every aspect of the estate. The gardens, once lush with vibrant blooms, now withered and decayed, mirroring the corruption that had taken root within the heart of the plantation. The air itself seemed to hum with a palpable tension, as if the very spirit of the land had been poisoned by the malevolence that Annie had unleashed. It was during this time that Annie's reputation as the White Witch of Rose Hall began to spread beyond the confines of the estate, her infamy reaching the ears of those who lived in the surrounding communities. Tales of her cruelty and the mysterious deaths that seemed to follow in her wake became the stuff of local legend, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared not cross her path. Yet, for all the fear and trepidation that Annie's name inspired, there were those who still dared to defy her. Brave souls, often among the lower ranks of the servants, would occasionally attempt to challenge her authority, only to disappear without a trace, their fates sealed by the wrath of the White Witch. It was in these moments of resistance that Annie's true nature was laid bare, a ruthless, uncompromising figure, driven by an insatiable hunger for power and control. She had embraced the dark arts with a fervor, wielding voodoo as a weapon to punish and terrorize those who dared to stand in her way. Her descent into darkness was complete, and the once vibrant Annie Palmer had been consumed by the very forces she had sought to harness. As the years passed, the legend of the White Witch of Rose Hall only grew, her name becoming synonymous with the dark and unsettling forces that were said to haunt the estate. The servants who remained, living in constant fear of her wrath, spoke of her in hushed whispers, their eyes downcast and their movements cautious, as if the very mention of her name might summon the wrath of the spirits she had enslaved. And so Annie Palmer's reign of terror continued, her grip on Rose Hall tightening with each passing day, a testament to the power of the dark arts and the enduring nature of the human capacity for cruelty and corruption. Chapter 4. The Enduring Legacy. The once grand estate of Rose Hall had fallen into a state of disrepair, its opulent facade now marred by the ravages of time and neglect. The lush gardens that had once adorned the grounds had withered and decayed, their colorful blooms replaced by a sea of overgrown weeds and tangled vines. The magnificent white columns that had once proudly supported the towering structure now leaned precariously, their pristine surfaces stained and crumbling. It was a sight that stood in stark contrast to the legends that continued to surround the once formidable plantation. For even as the physical structures of Rose Hall crumbled, The legacy of the White Witch, the notorious Annie Palmer, only seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. In the nearby village of Montego Bay, the whispers of Annie's dark reign were a constant refrain, passed down through the generations like a malevolent family heirloom. The older residents, their eyes darkening with a mixture of fear and reverence, spoke of the White Witch in hushed tones, recounting the tales of her cruelty and the unspeakable acts that had cemented her reputation as one of the most infamous figures in Jamaican history. They say her spirit still haunts the very ground of Rose Hall, an elderly woman murmured, her wrinkled hands trembling as she crossed herself. That the Loa, the spirits she once commanded, still linger, waiting to exact their vengeance upon any who dare to set foot on that cursed land. The younger villagers, though less inclined to believe in the supernatural, could not help but be captivated by the macabre allure of the White Witch's legacy. They whispered among themselves, sharing stories of the mysterious deaths that had plagued the once prosperous plantation, and the tales of Annie Palmer's descent into darkness and depravity. My grandfather used to say that the very air of Rose Hall was poisoned by the evil that Annie Palmer unleashed, a young man remarked, his eyes shining with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. That the spirits she summoned still roam the halls, seeking to claim the souls of any who dare to trespass. As the years passed, the legend of the White Witch only seemed to grow stronger, her name becoming synonymous with the dark forces that were said to haunt the once grand estate. Visitors from near and far would venture to the crumbling ruins of Rose Hall, drawn by the promise of encountering the lingering presence of Annie Palmer and the supernatural power that was said to still permeate the very stones of the structure. Yet, for all the tales and legends that surrounded the White Witch, the true legacy of Annie Palmer's reign was one of unimaginable horror and tragedy. For it was not only the servants and slaves who had fallen victim to her cruel and capricious nature, but the very essence of the plantation itself that had been corrupted by the darkness she had unleashed. The once vibrant and prosperous estate had descended into a state of decay and abandonment, a physical manifestation of the darkness that had consumed Annie's soul. The servants who had once lived in terror of her wrath had long since fled, seeking refuge in the surrounding communities, their memories of Rose Hall forever tainted by the horrors they had witnessed. And John Palmer, the once proud patriarch whose family had built the plantation into an enduring symbol of colonial wealth and power, had been left a broken and embittered man. Blinded by his own arrogance and the belief in the rigid social order that had elevated him to a position of privilege, he had been powerless to stop the descent of his beloved Rose Hall into ruin. As the years passed, John had retreated further and further from the world, retreating to the solace of his study, where he would sit for hours on end, his gaze fixed upon the weathered portraits that adorned the walls. It was as if he were trapped in a frozen moment in time, unable to reconcile the grandeur of his family's legacy with the bitter reality of its collapse. The only constant in this bleak and forsaken landscape was the lingering presence of Annie Palmer, whose legend only seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The White Witch had become a figure of both fear and fascination, her name whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror by those who dared to venture near the crumbling ruins of Rose Hall. For those who had dared to confront the darkness that Annie had unleashed, the scars were still raw and indelible. The servants who had managed to escape her wrath spoke of the unspeakable horrors they had witnessed, the twisted and macabre acts that had become the hallmark of the White Witch's reign. They told tales of voodoo rituals performed in the dead of night, of the Loa that Annie had summoned to do her bidding, and of the innocent lives that had been claimed in her relentless pursuit of power and control. The very air of Rose Hall, they said, had become poisoned by the malevolence that had taken root within its walls, a palpable darkness that seemed to cling to the skin and weigh upon the soul. Yet, for all the horror and tragedy that had unfolded within the confines of the plantation, there were some who saw in the legend of the White Witch a twisted and compelling allure. The younger generations, drawn to the macabre and the supernatural, found themselves captivated by the tale of Annie Palmer's descent into madness and the enduring legacy of her dark power. They would venture to the crumbling ruins of Rose Hall, their imaginations fueled by the whispered tales and the lingering sense of unease that permeated the very air. Some would claim to have glimpsed the ghostly form of the White Witch herself, her pale visage peering from the shadows, her eyes burning with an unholy light. Others, more skeptical of the supernatural, would seek to uncover the truth behind the legend, delving into the historical records and the first-hand accounts of those who had borne witness to Annie Palmer's reign of terror. They would piece together the fragments of her story, assembling a portrait of a woman driven by an insatiable hunger for power and a complete disregard for the lives she had destroyed. Yet, no matter how the story was told, the legacy of the White Witch of Rose Hall remained a fixture in the public consciousness, a testament to the enduring power of the supernatural and the dark forces that can shape a life. Even in the face of the crumbling physical remains of the once grand estate, the specter of Annie Palmer continued to loom large, her name a byword for the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of unchecked ambition. As the sun set over the decrepit ruins of Rose Hall, casting long, ominous shadows across the overgrown grounds, the whispers of the White Witch could be heard, carried on the gentle breeze that rustled the decaying foliage. It was a haunting reminder that the legacy of Annie Palmer, though tragic, would endure, a chilling cautionary tale of the darkness that can lurk within the human heart.